listening to the Booked on Planning podcast, a project of the Nebraska chapter of the American Planning Association. In each episode, we dive into how cities function by talking with authors on housing, transportation, and everything in between. Join us as we get booked on planning.
Welcome to the Hyde Lecture mini-series for the Booked on Planning podcast. We're here with Dr. Carissa Slotterback. My name is Ben Jones. I'm a master's student in the Community and Regional Planning program. This is my first semester at the University of Lincoln, and it's been great so far. I got my undergraduate degree in music education at the University of Nebraska, Omaha, so the career switch has been interesting. My interest in planning has come from wanting to advocate for marginalized communities through building affordable housing, enhancing walkability, and environmental justice. And it's interesting to be on the Booked on Planning podcast because reading a few of the more popular planning books is what got me initially interested in planning.
Thanks, Ben. And my name is Alex Napolitano. I am also a first-year master's student in the Community and Regional Planning program here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. I did my undergraduate degree at UNL as well, and I got my bachelor's in environmental and sustainability studies, which was a good segue into planning, I feel like. And actually, sort of similar to Ben, I am also passionate about sustainable urban development and additionally climate resilience planning. And I'm also interested in the intersection of mental health and well-being related to sustainable spaces and sustainable planning. And after I was admitted into the planning program, I was gifted a lot of books on planning, and it was excellent, and it's been a great supplement to my education so far. And we are here with Dr. Carissa Slotterback, a professor of planning and dean at the University of Pittsburgh. And Dr. Slotterback, if you would like to go in more in depth about yourself and the work you do, that would be great.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. Wonderful to chat with you, Ben and Alex, and really grateful to be part of the Hyde Lecture series in the College of Architecture at University of Nebraska-Lincoln. It's been a really great visit, and I'm really excited for this conversation. So as you shared, I am currently the dean in the School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Pittsburgh. I've been there just a little over 5 years, have done a lot of work in that school to make stronger connections to practice, enhance the work that we're doing related to community engagement, advance initiatives related to strategic planning and faculty hiring, and a number of other areas. And again, one of the key focus areas that I've been working on there is looking at ways that our programs, that our research can be more connected with communities, with organizations that sit outside of academia, that are important partners in the work that we're able to do. That work has been absolutely informed by my training as an urban planner. So I have a master's and a Ph.D. in urban and regional planning and spent 16 years at the University of Minnesota before I went to Pitt. I was a faculty member there, taught courses in environmental planning, land use planning, sustainability planning, capstone courses, and also courses in public engagement. And that was really foundational, was also doing research in those areas and building up a sense of why public engagement is important in urban planning, what the best practices are for doing it, and especially the ways that our thinking about what is good engagement in planning have actually changed quite a bit over time. Just a bit more about my background. I've had the opportunity to also apply that really strong commitment and sense of importance of community engagement in a couple of other leadership roles at Minnesota. I worked in the Vice President for Research office, leading research engagement. So looking at ways that we can match, connect, collaborate, bringing experience from the university, which is extensive, of course, and connect it meaningfully with expertise that sits outside, and whether that's in communities or nonprofit organizations, in government, in the private sector, looking at new ways that we can actually work together. Had the opportunity as well to create and lead the Resilient Communities Project, which was focused on identifying projects in communities, projects that were important to those places related to sustainability, related to resilient cities issues, and connect them with students from across the University of Minnesota. Those were really foundational to how I think about my work and especially the expectations that I have and want to advance within higher education.
Great. Well, we have a few questions for you. The first being, how does the process of planners partnering with organizations to improve community engagement work? And also, could you give an example of building capacity for shared leadership with those community organizations?
Yeah, as I alluded to in the opening comments, there's been really quite an evolution of our understanding of how to do public engagement effectively. A lot of focus early on, as practices were just starting to emerge, was on, well, let's have a meeting, a very sort of structured, organized, formalized opportunity for people to get involved. Often that occurred kind of at the end of processes where you might come and say, hey, look at this amazing thing that I created for you that you didn't actually have an opportunity to give any input on until we got to this point. They can often be intimidating opportunities, absolutely not accessible to many people, and especially leaving out people whose voices are really crucial and have been historically marginalized. So a recognition that we need to do better. We need to be doing engagement on an ongoing basis. We need to be strategic and intentional in reaching a much broader set of the population, of residents, of those in our communities who are impacted by what we do, and also have some really, really important knowledge for how we can actually do this work better. One example that I'll highlight really emphasizes the importance of partnering with organizations, adding capacity to what planners can do to be able to reach communities that have tended to be harder to reach, but are really important, again, in getting to really strong plans and policies related to urban planning. Recognizing that planners themselves may not actually be the right people in some cases to do the direct kind of engagement. There may be issues with trust. There may be challenges in building up a relationship. And we see more and more planning agencies and organizations partnering with advocacy groups, partnering with human service organizations, religious organizations, and others who tend to have closer relationships, especially with, again, communities that have been harder to reach and often not represented in planning processes. There's a great example from the Twin Cities in Minnesota of one of the transportation agencies doing this kind of work in partnership with a couple of local community organizations, paying those organizations to be meaningful, ongoing partners in this work so that they're able to go out and do the on-the-ground organizing, conversations with communities and people, and allowed those insights and facilitated those insights to be brought more effectively and even more fully into the process, and ultimately getting to better plans, which is what we're all here for in planning. Just to your question of how do you really think about building capacity for shared leadership with community organizations, I think, again, thinking about the ways that our expectations and practice has evolved related to public engagement, we recognize that we need to be bringing people in earlier into the process. And part of that bringing in early is doing that orientation to how does planning work. There's another great example, happens to be from Minnesota, that I worked on pretty early in my career. I was doing work related to environmental impact assessment, and the community was also updating its comprehensive plan. They made a choice as they were getting ready to launch the planning process to do a random sample of folks in their community and invite a sample of people to participate in an ongoing advisory committee for their comprehensive plan. Often when those kinds of advisory groups are formed, you're pulling in people who've been engaged before, who may be the loudest voices in the room, the people most strongly kind of engaged in the past. And we often miss people and the broader sort of swath of the community and the interests and the perspectives that are much more representative and much more important to the work that we're doing. So, it was a risk. It's something that isn't actually done all that much. You never know who you might get. Will they actually reply? Do they care about this? And really pleasantly surprised that almost everyone they reached out to did reply. They expressed interest and they participated. There's even, I heard after the fact that one of the people who was invited to this group who had no political experience before actually ran for elected office in that city. So thinking about that experience, that ability to influence and shape planning that's important to that community, and the capacity that's really built up over time as they get a chance to learn about, well, what is a comprehensive plan? What are the steps in the process? Who's responsible for approving the plan once it's done? What happens to it after? All of these pieces are really important for us to be doing public engagement effectively.
It's an excellent answer, and I think something that you don't think a lot about when it comes to planning is for the people. It's for the people in the community that you are working with, and if you don't have those voices that are essential, how can you possibly make a plan that's, comprehensive and important to them and making the changes that need to be made?
Absolutely.
So, yeah, I really appreciate that answer. And one of my questions is actually kind of within that public participation process and kind of focusing on how the community perceives planning action and those interactions. What would you say is the approach that does work the best to just engage a general person who isn't really involved in a conversation already? And also conversely, what is sort of the biggest barrier to those interactions taking place?
Yeah, I think, one of the key responsibilities, roles that we have is thinking about how we can reach groups, especially those who might be challenged in participating for whatever reason. It could be time, it could be experience, it could be trust, a wide range of issues. So really thinking about who has a stake in the work that you're doing, who has expertise that you need to complement the things that you know as a planner to actually get to a really good plan. That means, in some cases, moving beyond just sort of broad calls for participation, posting, a meeting notice in a newspaper or putting it out on the community's social media account, doing that kind of more personalized outreach, more tailored to different groups, working through intermediaries per the comment that I made related to the last question. What are organizations that might be better positioned to actually reach out to these populations? And then thinking about what are the capacities that people need in order to be effective and, be able to influence the planning outcomes or planning processes in meaningful ways. Thinking back to an example from when I was working as an urban planner. While I was writing my dissertation, I worked as a long-range planner for the city of Henderson, which is outside of Las Vegas, Nevada. So a really interesting place to do urban planning. So many just diverse issues to deal with. But I happened to, be able to do a lot of community engagement related to a variety of planning issues. In one case, actually, there was a group in a neighborhood that was starting to get organized to push back against a proposed development project. It was a gas station and some other things in a residential neighborhood. And so, we had some neighbors that were calling the city, coming into the office, participating in some of the initial meetings related to the project, and also maybe feeling like they weren't getting what they wanted out of that kind of engagement. So we got to a point where I was having conversations, kind of orienting them to, okay, this is how the process works. This is what's in the zoning ordinance. This is what's going to guide the decision related to this development project. Here's how the development proposal comes in. This is how we think about the comprehensive plan and how it's used as an evaluative tool related to whatever the zoning or planning decision was. And actually went to the house of one of the residents. She had organized a number of her neighbors together. They gathered in her living room. I came as a planner, sat down with that group and talked through, this is how the process works, giving them that information and really empowering them to be much better positioned to influence what was happening in their neighborhood. That little bit of knowledge about, how are these decisions made, position them in that case to be able to share their concerns, influence what might happen with the design, and also ultimately the decision. And they keep that capacity for the future. So really thinking about over time how we are engaging with a community, building a community that is interested, that is active, has the tools to be able to advocate for themselves, and are really become partners in the work that we do as planners.
Yeah, that's great. I think it's really interesting how you advocate for meeting with community members where they're at. I think it's great for, not only for the people in the community learning about planning, but also great for planners and understanding where people are coming from. That's awesome. So for people who are newly interested in planning or are getting started, such as myself, and after all, since we are on the Booked on Planning podcast, could you recommend any books or resources or ideas that people like that should know about?
Yeah, definitely. Well, and Ben, I know you mentioned reading some of the popular books on planning was one of the reasons why you ultimately got interested in it. And, people arrive at planning from all sorts of different directions. I know as an undergraduate, I was a first-gen student and was from a really small town. We didn't have a planner in our community. I didn't even know it was a thing, that it was a job, that it was a degree that you could pursue. I didn't really quite understand what grad school was even at that point. And, some of the early experiences that I had reading books focused on the environment, which I knew was an interest area of mine. I just didn't know quite what to do with it. But reading things like Silent Spring, for example, which is this foundational book in, understanding environmental impacts and the complexity of the policy environment for environmental issues, was really foundational for me in starting to make these connections in my brain of, okay, I'm interested in the environment. What are the tools that we actually have to do things that protect the environment? And then that led me through a variety of interesting circumstances to find planning and sort of realize oh, okay, this is amazing. And this is really what I want to be doing. So those kinds of entry points. But also, I think, for me, as I've continued in my academic career, as I've, gained knowledge and sort of my own understandings and sort of what I want to be bringing to this field through the work that I do, there's a couple of books that I think really kind of encapsulate how I think about this work. And one is Planning with Complexity by Judith Innes. Judy Innes is, an icon in the planning field. She wrote all of these articles about collaboration, about communicative planning, which are so foundational and really drove the field forward from, being characterized as very expert-driven, very physical-focused, very analytical, to something that is inclusive of those practices, but really is also thinking deeply about the ways that we're engaging with people, recognizing the complexity that exists in this work and really embracing it in some ways, not wanting to sort of control it or manage it or turn it into numbers or, reflect it on maps, but recognize that this is social work, this is human work, this is interactive work, and these skills of collaboration are absolutely essential. Someone who was writing even a little bit earlier than that has a great book called Coping with Uncertainty. It's Karen Christensen. They both happen to be at Berkeley. Karen was there, started there a little bit before Judith Innes. But those books, and I read Coping with Uncertainty while I was a Ph.D. student, were just so essential to kind of bringing me to this understanding that the human part of urban planning was really the most interesting part and where the most important questions were being asked. And, a piece of it that really motivated me. So I'd encourage those couple. I think also one of the complexities that we have in urban and regional planning is recognizing that all of these issues that we deal with are interconnected. So if you're interested in the environment, well, that's impacted by infrastructure. It's impacted by housing. It's impacted by industrial policy. It's impacted by soils and, everything else that we can possibly name. So I think, books and resources and ways of thinking that help us to see that complexity and be able to work within it are, I think, really, really useful kinds of resources.
Thank you so much for the recommendations. And Coping with Uncertainty is actually at the top of my reading list right now.
That's good.
Yeah, I am just so interested in that kind of complex relationship that planning kind of reflects on communities, and that people don't really think about planning. You don't really think about the underlying layouts of your city or how it could affect you or your mental health. And I think that's a big thing that drew me into planning. Was initially it was just environment. Like, how can I create a better built environment for our natural world? like within that and within doing readings, and Silent Spring is a great thing to bring up, you just really realize that that is so tied into how you feel and how your mental health is, shaped by these places. And so that's a really great thing to think about. And, with your reading suggestions, it's very apparent that that is kind of the line of thinking and very similar to how I got into planning as well. And so I really appreciate that. And those are great resources. And my question is sort of a segue into kind of talking more about the environment and the planning sphere specifically, because of course it's a consideration, but not everybody in planning is super environmentally focused. So that's something that I think is kind of interesting. And so how, like within your own conversations and, being directly involved in that community for so long, how do you get people that are already in the planning sphere, whether it be other planners or people that are directly engaged with the planning process, how do you get those people to prioritize environmental impacts and care about that outcome if they don't already, or if they're not really like directly thinking about it?
Yeah, that's another really, really great question. And thank you for sharing again how you're making sense of planning as well. It's such an exciting experience as you're a student and bringing all of these ideas together and really thinking about who you are in this work. But to your question about getting people to think about environmental impacts, and, there are certainly people who that is their issue. They are motivated. That is there are many people who come to planning processes, maybe opposing a development project or wanting to be actively engaged in a planning process because they really care about it. For others, that's not the case. They may be coming to the issue from some other different perspective. So a couple things on that. One is to be able to really be conscious about how we are talking about and depicting environmental impacts. A lot of environmental impacts we're not able to see them. They're not visual on our land. Some of them are, many of them are, but some of them are invisible to us. They may be related to groundwater. They may be related to air pollution. They may be nebulous and distributed at really large scales. We don't experience significant impacts at the individual level or even at the community level. But those of us who care about them, of course, recognize that these are really, really significant issues. And so I think looking at the ways that we can depict those issues in accurate, compelling ways to be able to visualize and really understand the significance of it. There's great examples of using technology, using mapping tools to be able to do this, ensuring that we're presenting technical data, which is, very prevalent related to environmental issues, that it's absolutely understandable and contextualized, and using examples to be able to demonstrate if we're talking about climate change or environmental changes on the landscape, giving a specific example about what that looks like, doing it at a scale that is visible, that is familiar, talking about a flood that was experienced for the first time in, 200 years that was greater than ever, helps make this more personal, familiar, visible, comprehensible for folks so that you can actually get to it. And I think also just recognizing, again, to the point I made before, is that environmental issues are connected to a whole bunch of other issues. I know you mentioned health before. There are health impacts. There are economic impacts. There are land use impacts. There are impacts on our transportation system. There are impacts on property values related to environmental issues and impacts. And thinking about the multiple entry points to begin talking about environmental impacts. That asks us to be capable in quantifying where we can the cost of environmental damage or the impacts of pollution, being able to talk about, translate environmental impacts into health impacts that are experienced by individuals, that are experienced more at a population level. Being able to make those connections is a really important piece. I've also done a lot of work on environmental impact assessment and policies that exist at the local, state, and at the federal level, and thinking about these tools as a means of documenting environmental impacts and a very broad definition of environmental impacts to include social impacts, the distribution of impacts that may have intersections with equity, for example, are important things that we have the potential to do when we're using those kinds of tools. To be able to identify the full range of those impacts, I think, is a really important piece.
Great. Well, I have one last question for you. Yesterday in our environmental planning and policy class, you had referenced a slideshow of some work you did working with farmers in Minnesota, and you showed a really intricate and yet really intuitive interactive GIS map. I'm in a GIS class now, and I actually posed the question to the class, have any of you seen anything like this before? Nobody said yes. So could you explain a little bit about how that map was created?
Yeah, definitely. Well, and GIS nor computer science are my own sort of core areas of expertise. So, definitely want to give credit to all the folks I collaborated with. So that was part of a project that was a really big team collaboration with colleagues at the University of Minnesota in ag ecology, soil science, applied economics, GIS, landscape architecture, and computer science to really build something that we could bring to a group of people, a group of stakeholders, to have a kind of conversation that they hadn't had before about the intersection between agricultural productivity, the ability to produce new agricultural commodities that had economic value, but also environmental value as we think about mitigating some of the environmental impacts. We talked about economic impacts as well as broader community impacts associated with it. So recognizing that this is a very complex issue, there's a fair amount of uncertainty, and there's a whole bunch of data that's relevant for the kind of conversation that we wanted to have with this group, we wanted to create a tool where they could actually use this data and make it legible, make it accessible, and turn it into a tool that they could utilize as a group to be able to imagine different futures for a landscape in a particular watershed in central Minnesota. It was a really interesting conversation. So started out with GIS layers. So we have layers of data, geophysical, environmental, agricultural productivity, soil characteristics, economic values by acre, integrated that into an interactive map and, displayed through hardware, which was essentially a very large iPad, like a big interactive touch screen, like a really big TV. We put it on rollers. We brought these things down to where we were meeting with this group in a community center in a small town in rural Minnesota and, wanted to be able to create this sort of interactive experience where folks could understand these various pieces of data, how they interact to be able to kind of shape how we might think about creating future landscapes. There's a lot of computer science and machine learning and data sets that come from a really wide range of sources there. But again, looking at a way to demonstrate the complexity but make it simple enough to use that anyone could feel comfortable going up to this screen, using slider bars to increase or decrease the visibility of the information, play with different components or assumptions of the tool so that they can actually explore something that feels authentic and realistic. There's, again, a lot of complexity behind it and a lot of people who had more responsibility with the technical aspects of it. But what I was able to do as a planner on this team, and the only planner on the team, is to bring that knowledge of how do we actually use all of this sophisticated data, this amazing technological mapping tool, and make it accessible to people. How might we integrate it into a longer collaboration and set of conversations that we were having with this group to ultimately get to a point where they could use it to do design of this landscape themselves, not us sort of doing designs and bringing them to them, but they actually being able to work with this data. And so it was really exciting to be part of a bigger team that brought all this different knowledge together and, with the common intention of being able to support a group of people who were deeply invested in these issues to, again, have a conversation that they hadn't been able to have before around complex data, a wide range of scales from farms to the Gulf of Mexico and impacts in between. It was really, really exciting. Just a very satisfying professional moment, a learning opportunity for me, and, I think a real demonstration of the impact that planners can have in shaping rich conversations.
That's amazing. And I am also in the same GIS class as Ben, and it is at times just feels so technical and difficult. And there's all these pieces that you have to put together and figure out, especially as somebody who does not really have a strong background in technology or computer science. And so it's very interesting, and it's unlike anything I've ever really worked with. But I really appreciate you talking about how you're able to kind of use that practically and how it's more of a team effort where there are those people with that technical expertise, but you still kind of have the background knowledge to be able to make it presentable to others. And I think that's something that's really important, is kind of being able to hear that story about how GIS was made accessible to a group of people with maybe little to no technological experience, or maybe they did have some, like background wise, but just somebody who maybe had even never looked at it to be able to actually use it, I think is very encouraging. And I really appreciate you talking about how you were able to bring this very, like you said, advanced technological tool and make it more of a user-friendly interface to kind of get these people to be able to see, what they do and how it impacts their land and things like that. So I really appreciate that. And yeah, I think we can wrap things up.
Yeah. Thank you for meeting with us.
Thank you so much for meeting with us and for taking the time and for being one of our Hyde Lecture guests.
Yeah, wonderful to be here. And yeah, thanks again for the invitation, and really pleased to be part of the podcast. Thank you.